Hello, this is Scott Ferguson, Principal Solution Architect with our Global Risk and Security practice. And for the next few minutes, I want to talk to you about GRC in general. And we'll give a high level or an executive overview of what GRC offers or has for our customers. So the first thing that we're going to do, so as an executive within your organization, right, you spend a lot of time, a tremendous amount of time, dealing with and working with people within the business. So the thing that they're always going to need, right, is to have a single place to go to everything that's coming out of your organization, whether it's, controls that they have to attest to or risks that they may need to answer a risk assessment, or even just knowing what policies have been published that they have to adhere to. Right, because as that IT executive or as that CISO or whatever that role may be, you're probably publishing, IT policies or security policies or acceptable use or disaster recovery policies. So having a single portal for your business to interact with you increases the efficiency and the effectiveness of that. So the first thing that we'll see as we look at this end user portal here is I have all of my policies published into one place. So regardless of whether it's individual, standards, right, and how you adhere to those, or the high-level policies or the procedures that someone needs to adhere to, they have one place to go to see the details of what it is that they have to do and why they have to do it. The other thing about the portal, right, is not only is it just those policies that are published there, but we want to make it real easy for them to complete those assessments, right? So when we talk about risk and they have to answer an assessment, we see the risk assessment in the very simple, easy way for them to be able to start that assessment process and answer the questions to provide the details that you and your organization needs to accurately reflect and understand what the impact to the business is. The other thing that we'll provide here is also that list and that view into the filtered down risk register or the filtered down set of controls, because again, in dealing with the business, you may only want them to see pieces and parts that apply to their organization or to their business unit, right? So in this case, we're providing visibility into all of the controls, right, that may be a part of that business or all of the risks from a risk register. But we also want to make it easy for them from a business perspective if they needed to be able to export this data in just a matter of a simple click. They can export that data and save it off as a report onto their desktop if necessary. The whole point here is that you have a single place. So whether it's policies from the governance framework, it's risks from risk management, it's controls from compliance, or it's those attestations and assessments, those questionnaires that they need to answer, your business has one place to go to interact with you. Now, when we switch over to things from within your organization, right? So as that executive, you're going to want to have a dashboard really to have visibility into everything across the organization. So whether it's, the vulnerability information or the SecOps information, right, my security controls, or even my business risks, we're going to provide you with a single dashboard, right? In this case, that dashboard that you can go and see the scope of everything across the entire organization. Now, let's take a step back, and we're going to take a look at a couple of the different pieces that make up what went into making this dashboard available to you and what went into making the information available on that portfolio or on that platform. So a couple of things to point out, right? So one of the things that we're going to help you do from a ServiceNow perspective is when we look at those policies, the first thing you'll notice is we are giving you some compliance scores. So if we drill into or we look at any one of these policies in particular, one, we're going to help your organization with the life cycle. So we're going to manage the life cycle and policy currency and making sure that people are reviewing and approving those policies in a timely manner so that information is always current. We're managing that through workflows and valid to dates. But the other thing we're going to do is we're going to allow you to tie those policies back directly to those authoritative sources. So if we look at something like an individual control template that's coming from various different citations, or it's going to come from various different authoritative sources, for that policy that I'm using, I can actually tie a control back. And in this case, I'm tying it back to FedRAMP, I'm tying it back to NIST, I'm tying it back to the Department of Defense, and I'm tying it back to the ISO 27001. Essentially, in one place, I can tie those authoritative sources, because on your dashboard, you just need to know not necessarily all the details, but am I compliant with something from a PCI perspective or a HIPAA perspective or a SOX perspective. Now, once these controls get put in place, the other thing that you're going to see here is we actually have the ability to monitor through continuous monitoring and prove that these controls are compliant or non-compliant. And if we take a look at one of these, and I'll drill into an individual control that may be assigned to someone within your organization, we have the ability to monitor through continuous monitoring the things in your environment to make sure that people are actually adhering to those controls. So in this case, when we look at a control for like managing change requests, I can do things like, well, let's validate that all of those changes that are approved have backup plans. So within the ServiceNow platform, this continuous monitoring to prove that you're compliant with those authoritative sources and prove that you're compliant with regulations, I have the ability to reach out into the other areas of the ServiceNow platform. And in this case, we can see that I'm looking at the change request application, and I'm pulling back any approved change that doesn't have a backup plan. You shouldn't have to monitor that. Your team shouldn't have to monitor that. So the ServiceNow platform is going to manage that for you, right? Be able to roll that information together and automatically mark controls as compliant or non-compliant, proving whether you're actually adhering to those things within your governance framework. Now, the thing about this from a compliance perspective is in many cases, these controls are also related to and are used to be mitigating or compensating controls for risk. So what we'll see here is part of this control here at the bottom is actually a list of the risks that this particular control was selected as a mitigating control. So we can see in this case, it is a mitigating control for loss of availability or loss of confidentiality of a risk. But as we kind of change our view here, right? So we talked about the governance framework, we've talked about compliance and managing those policies and how that ties directly to risk. But when you want to look at this from a risk through a risk lens, we're going to start with our risk dashboard. And when you look at our risk dashboard, the first thing that you'll notice is I have visibility into everything across the entire ecosystem, both from an inherent and a residual perspective. So regardless of whether your organization uses a qualitative approach by looking at impact and likelihood and mapping that out on a heat map, you're going to see that here on your dashboard. Or if you use a quantitative approach and you look at things like single loss expectancy and annual rate of occurrence to give you an annualized loss expectancy, if that quantitative approach is something you adhere to, we're also going to give you visibility into that and understanding, in this case, the true loss expectancy of managing that risk, or that risk being exploited. Comparing inherent and residual risk is what you have to do when you respond to that risk. So the first thing we're going to do, and ServiceNow gives you the ability to filter and give us one-click kind of dashboarding here. So if I wanted to look at our financial application, right? So you've got maybe a meeting coming up with the CFO or your financial officer, and you needed to understand the risks that were involved with delivering those services, right? And that service to your financial organization or your finance department. With my dashboard, I could filter in and look at specifically the financial application or the financial accounting application. And I can see very quickly that there's a very high risk here on my dashboard. And I can drill into that. And that actually takes me in to a filtered view of the risk register. So ServiceNow does provide you a risk register. If I drop one of those conditions off, you can see here that now I now see all risks that relate back to my financial application. This is a very dynamic list, and I can then use this and export this data. I can filter it and report on it in different manners. But for the time being, if we look at that risk that that showed up on our dashboard, right? Because I'm about to go into my meeting with the CFO, a couple of things. I can see that one, that risk had an entire life cycle, right? Someone had to assess it, and we saw what that assessment looked like on the portal just a few minutes ago. And then we go through the process of looking at this risk, and your team has to decide, are they going to transfer, are they going to avoid, are they going to accept, or are they going to mitigate that particular risk? And ServiceNow is going to provide the workflows for your team to manage those appropriately. In the case of mitigating a risk, right, we see that it's created a risk response task. And now our user has to go in, right? That member of your risk team has to go in and define what our risk mitigation strategy is. On that risk mitigation strategy, they can define and say, well, here are the additional controls that I want to associate to this risk as mitigating controls. And they define what that response plan is going to be. When we look at that risk, though, a couple of things you're going to notice is, one, if we look at all of the controls that have been related to this, we've got some of them are compliant, some are non-compliant. And I would challenge and say that if you've got non-compliant mitigating controls that are supporting that particular risk, you're probably not achieving your residual risk score. And now you've got exposure that you were unaware of before. You've got something within the environment that you need to address. But not only is it the non-mitigating controls, but we also have these key risk indicators. And the key risk indicator, in this case, I can do things like monitor for a security incident. So when you go to talk to the board, or you talk to that CFO, right, and you talk about how you've resolved a security incident, and that may not sound like it was anything special. But in this case, if I can monitor for that security incident for my risk, and when I identify this and we see that this morning we identified that there was a security incident that had to do with the loss of employee or financial data, right? That has a bigger impact on the organization. It's not just closing, a security incident in the SOC. So what we have here is, because this indicator identified that, and it marks that indicator as a failed state, it automatically generated an issue for us for that risk. And more importantly, when we look at the scoring of this, we see that there's, we started off as very high, and we put in this great risk mitigation strategy that drove us to very low. But now we can see that the calculated annualized lost expectancy for this risk is now, and this exceeds $12 million. And that's a direct impact of the fact that we've got controls that are non-effective, or that we've got an open security incident. And now it's not just that we closed a security incident, but if we close that incident, we can say that we've eliminated $12 million of actual loss or annualized lost expectancy, because you see the target here was actually only $1 million. So understanding terms, in risk management of actual risk exposure based upon other things going on in the environment give you the information that you need to go have that conversation with the CFO. When it's all said and done, from a risk perspective, you come back to that risk dashboard, and this is what you use to really understand, right, from an annualized loss, from an ALE perspective, from a quantitative perspective, what is the actual risk exposure that we have in the organization based upon those calculated risk scores and my key risk indicators. Now, bringing all of this information together, right, is you start to deal with your audit organization. They're going to look at your policies. They're going to look at your controls. They're going to look at your risks, and they're going to they trust you, but they need to verify, right? They know that you guys are doing a good job within your organization, but they need to validate that so that they can, prove that to an external organization, or say that you still, have achieved a particular certification. Well, that comes in the form of audit engagements within the ServiceNow platform. So within your team, when that external auditor comes to your team and says, I need to do a financial audit, or I need to do an ISO or a data center audit, or we need to do one of these different audits, any one of these require different resources and different activities, and managing that can be very overwhelming for an organization. And in many organizations, many like yourself, they manage that through emails and spreadsheets, and it becomes very easy, and you end up with a lot of duplication of effort. So within ServiceNow, you obviously are going to have your audit dashboard where you can kind of view the status of everything, but more importantly, you're going to have this audit workbench where you can see those people in your organization, right? Who's working on what? What do I have in flight? And in this case, I've got a finance audit, and I've got a sales and marketing audit, I've got an IT audit, and they're all going on at the same time. So if I pick up on one of those engagements, and in this case, if we look at the customer service audit that may be going on, right? Because we need to prove that, from that we provide information maybe from a GDPR perspective, right? Someone needs to be able to opt in or with the right to be forgotten. We need to make sure that customer service is adhering to those things that they should be adhering to, right? So we're going to go through this customer support audit. Now, when we look at that, the first thing you're going to do, right, is you have to define who's in scope. And we're going to give you the ability to do that from an asset perspective. And within your team, they're going to have, because of that, the system is going to automate the ability to bring in the risk library, the control library, what are those things that they have to adhere to, as well as all of the test plans, right? And that test plan that says, did your team design the process properly, and are they actually adhering to it? And from those test plans, they're going to generate their control tests, where they're going to use evidence already gathered by the policy and compliance and the risk application. They're going to evaluate all of that information, and if they mark something as non-compliant or ineffective, it's going to generate their findings records, and you're going to have one place to go to see, what are all the findings that have come about as part of that particular engagement. When it's all said and done, right, you have to go talk to the board. You have to talk to the stakeholders. You may have to go in and meet with the CISO. You want to be able to just get one report that gives you all the information that you need to be armed to go in and have that conversation. So within the audit application, I can generate my audit report. And in that audit report, it's going to say, we've talked to customer service. We evaluated what we were doing. Maybe this, we wanted to make sure that they were adhering to all of the GDPR regulations. I can see all of those things that were found, right? What was uncovered, what's the recommendation, what's the response to that, what's the explanation of why it occurred. I'm going to have all of those findings documented as part of my audit report, and I can simply publish that. And now I've got that stored, I've got that captured, and if someone else comes back in, I can see simply by just looking at the report that here was the report that captured everything that we had done. So bringing that all together from a governance framework and my policies and my controls, all of the risks, we brought all of that together into an audit engagement, and it proves that we're actually being compliant with the policies that we've set forth in the organization. We've addressed managing your compliance and your activities and your risks and your audits from an internal perspective. But you have to be concerned also about risk when it comes to those third parties that you do business with. So the fourth application that ServiceNow has as part of GRC is a vendor risk application. And the first part that we're going to see here is actually the vendor portfolio. And that vendor portfolio is going to allow us to see who are those vendors. In this case, I'm going to pick one that we do business with, right? But from a rank tier perspective, are they a tactical supplier? Or are they a strategic partner, right? Are they just a valued or are they blacklisted? But we also have a risk tier, and that risk tier is what we're going to use. Someone that's a high risk tier, in this case, may have PII, your personally identifiable information, or your financial data, or cardholder data. They have access to that. They're going to be a higher risk tier versus the vendor that just delivers paper to the dock, right? They don't have access to data. They're going to be a lower risk tier. So part of this portfolio is going to allow you to manage those vendors that you have access to. Or do business with. The next part of this is you actually want to generate assessments. So the vendor risk assessments are going to allow you to assign an assessment with a questionnaire, and ServiceNow supports the standard information gathering. The SIG is already built into the ServiceNow platform. So all those people that you've asked for, you want to be able to ask them those questions within the ServiceNow platform. So in this case, we're going to assign an assessment to that particular vendor, and we're going to ask them for particular documents or have them answer a particular set of questionnaires. Now, I'm going to switch, though, in this case, from my GRC user within the ServiceNow platform, and I'm going to switch over to the next part of the vendor risk application, which is the vendor portal. The vendor portal then gives that vendor, and this is a way for, in this case, my contact at that vendor to be able to access their data through a website. So in this case, Alex, who is my primary contact, can see what are those assessments that they have to respond to. And there's a quality assessment here that is currently in progress that they have to provide some information. But here's the thing, in answering these assessments, typically, right? They need help from other people within their organization. So through this portal, we're also going to delegate user authority. So your team doesn't have to manage who has access and who doesn't, and who's providing the answers. That team can do it themselves. So Alex can go in here, he can manage his own team, and in this case, he can actually have someone, from his technology group, from his legal group, from his sales group, from the HR group, and they can all have their own pieces and parts of answering these questionnaires or providing document requests. So when we look at that assessment, right? So in this case, Alex, we've asked him to provide a couple of things, right? We've asked them to provide the updated SOC 2 report, and we can see here when we said, do you have this? And they said no, right? And that's going to be flagged as an issue, right? But then in the case of the SOC 1 report, we ask them for this, and they have that, and they attach that particular document as part of this particular request. And we can see that that's attachment is part of this assessment. But it's more than just document requests. If we go back to this, we actually wanted them to complete the SIG Lite. So part of what we've done here with the ServiceNow portal is actually allow them to just directly upload the SIG Excel spreadsheet into the portal, and we parse out all of the questions, but we've also made it backwards compatible, right? You want all of the answers to the 2017 version, but they have got a spreadsheet that's the 2015 version. We're actually going to parse through, and in this case, if there's questions that haven't been answered that are newer, they can see the progress, they can go into those sections directly, and in this case, they would want to answer those questions that have been outstanding or that they have not answered yet. They could do those directly online. Now, your team is going to go through the process. This is going to get submitted. They're going to evaluate all of those responses. They're going to generate some issues as part of that. And what's going to happen here is when that issue gets generated by your team, as it goes through that workflow, the issue shows up here directly in the portal. And in this case, maybe they answered one of those 6 questions around password complexity, and your team, right, has a policy around what password complexity looks like. So the issue that was generated was around insufficient password complexity. You now have one place. Now, the value here is that conversation that happens and the agreement that gets made isn't stored in someone's email, and when they move into a different department, you lose that history or that context. We have an issue record managed directly within the platform where multiple people, whether it's the vendor or your internal vendor managers, can update these records, and they're managed directly as an issue throughout the ServiceNow portal. If we switch back to that vendor view, you can now see, in this case, right, your vendor manager has the ability to see all of that information. They can see the responses that have come back. They can see all of the details, the progress that's being made, right, is part of those, because that's always a big issue and not knowing how far along they are. And then they directly create their issues right from within the vendor risk application. And then to wrap this all up, you can actually have, in this case, if you have an internal control, so going all the way back to policy and compliance where we started, maybe you have an internal control that says we require 2-factor authentication for all of our applications. And this third-party vendor, because they answered a question a certain way, that question ties directly to one of my internal controls. So when you think about big stories that you've heard on the web around how a third party has affected a large organization, right, because of access or something that they shouldn't have had access to. In this case, my internal control around 2-factor authentication has listed in it right here, well, here are the vendors that have answered this question in a way that we didn't like. And I can automatically have my control go non-compliant based upon the way a third-party vendor responds to a question. We wanted to, as we go through the whole application here, we want to look at the fact that within the ServiceNow platform, we're giving you the ability to continuously monitor, right, using policy and compliance that helps control your enterprise's risk exposure, right? Those controls and continuously monitoring that is going to have a direct impact on your risks. We're able to help you quantify the risk to the business, right? Making it easy to prioritize those high-risk issues, right? And making sure that they're addressed first based upon the impact to the organization. And finally, we're going to help automate process, which saves tremendous amount of time when it comes to letting your team focused on the high-value tasks and not get bogged down by the mundane. So this wraps up an overview of ServiceNow GRC and all 4 applications from policy and compliance, risk, audit, and vendor risk. And if you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to check out our website for further information.